Hi, I'm Ezra Boggs, and even Christians watch The Atheist Edge.
Thank you, and welcome to the Atheist Christian Book Club, a special edition. You didn't have to read a book for this one. How many is thankful for that? We do have a special guest, and I'm going to get our co-host. I'm James Walker, the president of Watchman Fellowship, an evangelical Christian apologetics organization. But I'm also the co-host, the co-founder of the Atheist Christian Book Club. It's a monthly gathering where atheists and Christians gather together to look at important books from both perspectives. And I would like our co-founder, Bill Cluck, to take just a few minutes and introduce our special guest for this special edition of the book club.
Yeah, we really are lucky to have Tim with us. Tim is a professor of philosophy, is it, at Western Michigan. He's debated the great Bart Ehrman as well as many other notable atheists, and kind of the best kept secret of apologists. The fellow James told me Tim had an encyclopedic mind, that how brilliant he was, and when I met him and listened to his YouTube videos, he was absolutely right. And one thing I really admire about Tim is, the church's questions are an anathema to Christians. They just cannot tolerate questions. Tim embraces questions. And he'll be with you guys. He's going to be happy to answer any questions, and he's going to be nice enough. And first of all, it was really nice of him to come visit us, because he's got an incredibly busy schedule, and to come here is just outstanding, a guy with his caliber. So anyway, he has Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted.
Happy to sign your copies.
And as you guys probably know, Bart Ehrman was one of the major reasons that I left the faith. And, maybe Tim can help me out here and get me back in the fold. So, who else have you debated, Tim?
Peter Boghossian, a manual for creating atheists, a street epistemology guy. That was also on Justin Brierley's program, The Unbelievable Show. And we invited him back for round 2, but he's been too busy for the past 3 years or so.
Mm-hmm. And he did, at the Bible and Beer Consortium, he debated Zach Moore, one of the local atheists, and Zach pretty much laid down and said, I can't win this debate. It really was unfair, because this is his background. This guy knows his stuff. So, we're really looking forward to hearing.
I'd just like to say Zach and I are still good friends to this day. So, but there's a story behind that. Can I just tell a fast story?
Sure.
Yeah, so I didn't really quite know how things worked at the Bible and Beer for debates. So this was in a big venue, and we're standing, all these chairs up there. It would have fit this crowd even. And so I was standing there, and somebody comes up to me, and he offers me a blue bracelet. So I'm looking at it. I'm like, what? He said, well, were you going to buy a drink at the bar? And I just smiled, and I pointed at Zach, and I said, give him 2 of them.
Well, another thing that Tim was gracious enough to join us when we were discussing Bart Ehrman's book, and he had interviewed on the same book, or actually debated with Bart Ehrman on the book, and answered some questions. And the nature of that for our club was he had to deal with very, very quick topics. So one of the things that we want to do is, hey, you got some of the low-hanging fruit, and you did raise some good issues with Bart Ehrman's book, but I want to know what's the toughest thing that Bart Ehrman said. When you go through his whole book, what were the ones that's kind of hard to answer? And he said, well, there's a couple that are harder, but it takes more than 3 to 5 minutes to unpack. So I said, can you just pick one of those for us, one of the topics, and unpack it? And he said, well, maybe his best foot forward, his strongest case might be, did John get it wrong, the Gospel of John, on what day Jesus was crucified? Did he purposely change the date of the crucifixion in order to make some kind of theological point and stuff? So maybe you could take about 15 or 20 minutes and unpack that for us.
Sure.
And then maybe we can see what we can do along those lines. And again, this is on the question of what day was the crucifixion.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to do justice to this, see if I can do that, and I'll also try to leave enough time that we can just sort of go scattershot and take what your real questions are after I deal with this one. But this is an interesting one. So let me first start by quoting Bart from Jesus Interrupted. In my edition, it's page 26. Different printings have slightly different page numbers, but y'all can find it if you want. Here's what he says. In Mark's Gospel, Jesus lived through that day, that is the day before the Passover, had his disciples prepare the Passover meal and ate it with them before being arrested, taken to jail for the night, tried the next morning, and executed at 9 o'clock a.m. on the Passover day. But not in John. In John, Jesus dies a day earlier, on the day of preparation for the Passover. There's a claim in Bart's own words. I always like to say, when somebody makes a claim like that, the very first thing you need to do, I don't care if you're a Christian or an atheist, I mean, I care, I love you, but I don't care for this purpose. You need to just read the texts for yourselves. Whoever's telling you this is what it says, double check it, because there are a lot of people who play a little fast and loose on both sides. So get a Bible. The Christians will be happy to give you one if you don't have one. And open it up. Oh, and Christians, if you got a copy of the message, burn it. Just saying. Okay, so let's read the text for ourselves. I'm going to be quoting from the English Standard Version, or ESV. It's a modern translation. It's done from the sort of consensus text families, and not doesn't have some of the passages that are disputed that you'll find in the King James, for example. So I find it's a pretty literal translation, but readable, so that'll work for us. Mark 14:12. And on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Okay, so then follows the Last Supper. Clearly, then, Jesus is going to eat the Passover. But John 19, verse 14, so we're contrasting now, Mark with John, says, describing the scene where Jesus is condemned to be crucified. Now, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. Bart wants you to read that as a problem, as a contradiction with Mark. I've thrown the Greek in there not because I'm trying to show off, but because some of you will recognize that there is a genitive in there. It's a possessive, to pascha. And so the question is, how should we render the genitive there? That's going to come back up, actually. I try to avoid just Greek bullying because everybody hates that, right? Who wants to be told, well, you just didn't read it right in the original language. But we're going to have to deal with this because it's one of the cruxes of the argument. So what's the apparent contradiction? In Mark, the Last Supper takes place on the first day of Passover. Jesus is arrested that night. He's crucified the next day, which is the first day, as Jews reckon days. The day starts at nightfall, so he's crucified on the first day of Passover. According to Ehrman, John tells us that the crucifixion took place on the day of preparation for the Passover. Notice not of Passover now, but for Passover. That is the day before the Passover. Well, let's go back and look more closely at what John really says. He does not say that it was the day of preparation for the Passover. It's just a genitive. But the genitive could carry that as one of the possible interpretations. So, the really interesting word here is preparation. Now, we all think we know what that would have to mean, right? Well, you prepare for something. You prepare for a meal. You're getting that meal ready, and then the thing comes afterward. But the funny thing is, Mark uses the very same term. He says, and when evening had come, since it was the day of preparation, but then he tells you what he means by it. That is, the day before the Sabbath. In other words, what Mark is being very explicit about is that preparation is not preparation for the Passover, it's preparation for the Sabbath. And in fact, that Greek word, paraskue, has been used from the first century onward, and still to this day is used to mean Friday, day before Saturday, Saturday being the Sabbath. Well, okay, that's what John says, but what about what Mark says? Let's go back and go back and forth and read these guys a little bit more closely. So here, again, is some of the text of John 19. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. Now, wait a minute, this is John, but he's saying the next day is the Sabbath. The problem is, if they stay up on the cross as night falls, you're into the next day, because that's when the day starts. from the Jewish perspective. So that's going to be into the Sabbath, and they're not allowed to leave the dead bodies up on the Sabbath. The Jews are really very scrupulous about this. They won't allow bodies, even of a criminal, to go unburied. This is something that's enshrined in their law. So John agrees with Mark, at least to this extent, that it was the day before Sabbath. And it looks like this is what John means by preparation. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And this is the reason why I picked this one, James, when you said that. So there are 3 passages that we need to look at before we could go with this reading, because there are places where it looks like there's counter arguments. So let's look at those 3 passages, or at least 3 questions about passages. First of all, what does John mean when he says, for that Sabbath was a high day? Now, my take on this, and you can dispute this and we can have a conversation about this, is that he means that it's a particularly special feast day. It's not just any Sabbath day. This is a Sabbath in Passover week. Think about Sundays. We have Sundays, but some Sundays are more special Sundays than others, and we've got one of them coming up. I know all of the atheists here are really happy that it's on April Fool's Day. But the point is that when we refer to Easter Sunday, we are designating that Sunday is a special Sunday, and I think that what John is doing here is saying the same thing. And if you don't take that interpretation that Sabbath was a special day because it's Sabbath in Passover, then you need some other interpretation of what John is saying. It's not obvious what else it would be saying. Second question, what about John 18? Because now we've got a piece of evidence that looks like it will put a nail in the coffin for the theory that I'm trying to put forward for you. Here it is, again in the ESV. Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves, Jewish leaders, did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. Uh-oh! Tim is saying Passover's already done, but John is saying they didn't want to go in there because they wanted to eat the Passover. So doesn't this just contradict the claim that Passover has already taken place? Seems like an obvious way to read this. And this is where things get really interesting. To answer that question, we need to nail down some facts about Passover. First, Passover, as the term was used at that time, is not just one day. It's a festival. And the festival goes 8 days. Throughout the Gospel of John, the word Passover occurs 8 other times. It always refers to the festival as a whole, not just to what is called the Seder, the meal that kicks it off. So it seems like there's at least some question then. If Passover can refer to this whole feast, then, and the Seder is only one meal, then what about other meals? Could they have been referring to another one? Well, it turns out there's another ritual meal the next day, the Hagigah, which is eaten at midday. That matters. The fact that the Hagigah is not an evening meal, but is a midday meal, matters. Why? I mean, how deep in the weeds am I going to drag you poor people before I pitch the ball? All right, well, let me just establish, because some people I have argued with have tried to contest the idea that Passover is used this way. They're not like, no, there's the Passover, and then there's the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And you're just smushing them together. So I'm going to go to a first century Jewish source, Josephus. I'm going to show you his usage so that you can see a first century guy who was in Palestine, became governor of Galilee in the 60s during the disastrous Jewish war. Here's what he says. Here's how he uses the term. Antiquities 14. And this happened at the time when the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which we call Passover. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, which we call Passover. So he's deliberately identifying the two. Again, in Book 18 of the Antiquities. As the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which we call Passover, was being celebrated. Okay, so his usage shows Jewish usage at the time, and that is to roll together these two festivals and to call it all Passover. There are 5 other passages in Josephus that I could cite, but I will definitely bore you more if I do that. So let's just move on. So here's why it matters that the Seder is celebrated at night, but the Chagiga is a midday meal the next day. If the chief priest had entered Pilate's dwelling and had been defiled by doing that, the defilement would expire at sundown. All they need to do is wash their hands, and then they're good to go. So if they don't want to enter his dwelling because they want to eat the Passover, and it's an evening meal that's in view, this explanation makes no sense. Why would John even be saying they were concerned about that? Passover Seder is an evening meal. It's after sundown. Wait till sundown, wash your hands, sit down and enjoy your lamb. No problems. But if it's a midday meal, you can't eat it because your defilement doesn't pass until the sun goes down, and the meal's already eaten by that time. So the midday meal is problematic. Then John's explanation for why they didn't want to go into Pilate's dwelling would make sense. But it doesn't make sense if John is trying to say they're afraid they can't eat the Seder. Okay, so they have to be concealed about some other meal. It can't be a concern about the Seder. So if the Seder was already over, though, then they're concerned about something else, and the Chagiga fits the bill. Is that a proof? No, that is not a proof. When you're reading old documents and you're trying to do history, you can't get mathematical demonstrations, and I'm not going to pretend to you that it is. I do think, however, that it's evidence, and maybe I can make it poignant by putting it this way. In order to make John contradict Mark, you have to make John contradict John. I submit to you that basic charity and fairness in reading should make you reluctant to do that. And it's a kind of charity we'd all like people to exercise when they're reading what we have to write. If you've got to make John make a fool of himself in order to make him contradict Mark, something's going wrong, and we ought to back up and rethink. One more question, though, and this is one that Bart does mention, so I need to deal with it. Back in John 13, isn't the meal in John 13 a different meal from the Last Supper in the Synoptic Gospels? I don't think that it is, but Bart does. Here's what he has to say. They do eat a final supper together, but in John, Jesus says nothing about the bread being his body or the cup representing his blood. Instead, he washes the disciples' feet, a story found in none of the other Gospels. What Bart is using here is what is known as an argument from silence. This source doesn't mention this thing, but if it had happened, surely he would have. Therefore, it must not really have happened. Arguments from silence in history are very, very slippery things, and we need to be very careful about them. Let me give you a few examples from secular history, so that you don't think I'm just padding things out with religious examples. Ulysses Grant has 2 volumes of memoirs of the Civil War. Some of you may have looked these up. In his memoirs, which must have been written up from diary entries at least sometimes because there are dates besides specific entries, there is no mention of the Emancipation Proclamation. Did he just miss it? Come on, right? This was even an event that had military significance because it was designed to prevent England from coming into the war on the side of the South. Coulda, woulda, shoulda. We can't imagine not making a big deal about it. He doesn't mention it. Marco Polo, Il Milione, writing about his travels across China, never mentions the Great Wall of China. No, it wasn't today's Ming Dynasty creation, but still you can imagine some of his friends asking, think, Marco, did you see something 15 feet high, 20 feet wide, hundreds of miles long? No, he missed it. But think, Marco, where did you have it last? He just doesn't mention it anywhere. He doesn't mention foot binding. He doesn't mention printed books, although he mentions printed money, so you would wonder how could he miss it. I was so astonished when I read that he doesn't mention these things. I actually went and I got the Yule edition of Marco Polo, and I looked at the editor's comments, and the editor himself notes that, no, he doesn't mention this. So really, truly, he doesn't. The archives at Barcelona have no record of ships having found a new world sailing into harbor. It's just not there. Herodotus, in his histories, doesn't mention the existence of Rome. Hello, Rome, just west of you, has a military treaty with Carthage already. His eyes are turned eastward. So there are things we think people couldn't have left out, and they do. So we need to be very careful about arguments from silence. They're very slippery things, and it's easy for us to fool ourselves because we anachronistically paste down our perspective. We think these things are fabulously important now, right? Well, we now think Jesus must have been the most important person of the first century, so why didn't more Roman historians write about him? Who? Some peasant despised even by the Jews who we despise out there somewhere in the far eastern provinces? Why should we care about that? Just wasn't a big deal at that time. Yeah, in hindsight, it looks like a big deal. But we have to be very careful about not reading that back into history in that way. Besides that fact, though, let me give you two undesigned coincidences, two interlockings here between two of the Gospels, not the same story in the same words. Everybody knows what it means when the same story is told in the same words. Either one of these guys got it from the other one, or they both got it from some common written source, because when you have honest witnesses telling about the same events and not collaborating, they don't use the same words like that. So let's talk about some interlockings instead. Let's start with Luke 22. Here is a story from the Last Supper. Jesus says to them, "For who is the greater? The one who reclines at table or one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at table? But I am among you as the one who serves." Now here's the funny thing, and I need to ask you to do me a favor here. Don't take my word for it. Read these texts for yourselves. I will make these slides available to everybody, so you won't have to wonder if you're misremembering the references. Go and read all the way through the surrounding passage around Luke 22 and see if you can find an answer to this question. What could Jesus be referring to when he says, "I am among you as one who serves"? I will tell you, but I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to convince yourself that there is nothing in the context that would answer to that question. But what do we find in John 13, which I claim was the same meal? Okay, Jesus rose from supper, he laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. So only John records the event that makes sense of Jesus' statement in Luke. But this one goes both ways. This is kind of a fun one. In John, why does Jesus wash their feet? Well, all it says at the beginning of John 13 is Jesus, having loved his disciples, loved them to the end, and when they sat at meat, he rose, and then it's like you do this with every meal, or what? What's going on here? There is, but I don't want you to take my word for it. I want you to go back. I want you to read John 12 and the lead up, and I want you to go into John 13 and go all the way through it. There's no provocation for this. But if you go back over to Luke's account, a few verses earlier, here's what we read. A dispute arose among them as to which of them was to be regarded as the greatest. So only Luke mentions the dispute that explains why Jesus would give them the lesson in servanthood, which lesson is reported only in John. That's not, which of these guys copied from the other? That's not copying, that's interlocking. If that were the only undesigned coincidence in all of the Gospels, that wouldn't be interesting. But actually there are dozens of these, crisscrossing the text in all directions. And I know what some of you are thinking. I see it behind your eyes. You're thinking, yeah, but what about all the contradictions too? And we can talk about those. Let's bring them up. After all, chapter 2, A World of Contradictions, is what provoked me to go into this and to choose this as Bart's best example. So I'll just close with a word from one of the all-time top theologians. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. Insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories, instead of theories to suit facts. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Tim. And so in my interview back in January in New Orleans, when we talked about kind of envisioning this meeting, we said, well, let's do most of it Q&A. So then let anything be available. So obviously some of you may have had questions about other chapters or other sections of Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Interrupted, that we didn't get to. How many of you got to watch the 20 or so minute video on the three arguments for theism? A number of you got to watch that. That's another hopefully thought-provoking, but it really is what.
In other words, here's the target. Go for it, guys.
Tim said, let it be stump the chump. So any question out there, it doesn't have to be related to what we've been talking about, Art of Bart Ehrman, and if he doesn't know the answer, I'm sure he'll say he doesn't know the answer, but
you'll find those pretty quick.
Yes, we'll find those pretty quick. So if you have a question and want to raise your hand, and we'll try to take those one by one.
Just before we leave the topic you were just on, when you're talking about all the other examples of interlocking or undesigned coincidence, is there a source somewhere where we could find that? Because that would be a lot of research to dig that out.
There are, yeah. So
coincidentally,
it's a twofer for you. Okay, my wife and I have been studying this argument now for a number of years, and we made a deal that one of us would write a book on it, whichever one of us got to it first. She beat me. So she's got a book, came out exactly 1 year ago, March of 2017, called Hidden in Plain View, Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts.
Excellent.
And she goes through different sets of them. There are the undesigned coincidences where the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, explain John. There are the ones where John explains the synoptics. There are the ones where the synoptics explain one another. And then she goes into looking at the connections between the book of Acts and Paul's letters. And she separates those out. She takes the 7 that even Bart Ehrman will agree are written by Paul and looks at those interconnections. And then she takes the disputed epistles and shows some interconnections there as well. But so that you do not think that I am saying this so as to sell you a book, this is a revival of an older argument. And there's a book by John James Blunt, which you can get free. It's out of copyright. It's public domain. I will send you a PDF of it. Blunt covers even more undesigned coincidences in the Gospels, but sometimes, not real often, but once in a while, his examples depend upon a reading that comes from a text family that would not be the more sort of Alexandrian text family. And so one of the things that Lydia did as she went through the material was to call out any examples that somebody could object to on the grounds that there might be a textual variant that would undermine it. And so she's presenting you only with the ones that she thinks are, to that extent, bulletproof.
Excellent.
So if you would like to buy a book, I do think it's a really excellent book. But if you would rather not spend money, I get that. I understand. You don't want to support the Christians any more than you have to. And so,
well, I am one.
All right. Well, we got a show for you right now. So if you'd like a free book, just tell me, and I will put you on the path of that. But I'll just tell you, I've tried to give fair warning. There are a couple of places where in that book you might find somewhere you try to look it up in a modern text, and it would say, wait, no, this verse is in dispute, or the reading in that verse is in dispute. And I just full disclosure.
I'm excited about it, and this was not a setup. This has worked out.
I was sure of it.
I have some with us today too. Right?
Yeah.
Well, great.
We'll give you your cut afterward.
Let me just say this to kind of set the stage a little bit more too. We've had 2 or 3 more people come in, so I think this is the record now. I think we just passed our Aaron Ra record.
Oh dear,
so,
he's not going to like
Something
that.
is greater here than Aaron.
Even the great Aaron Ra.
Aaron doesn't like anything. It's all right.
Let me just get a kind of a feel. How many of you are here for the? Can you get a shot? Okay. How many of you are here for the first time? This first time at the Atheist Christian Book Club. Can somebody help me with the count on that?
6, 7. One back here behind. Oh, 2.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Is that right? 7 brand new.
Okay.
Oh, 7, 8 new people. And how many of you are Christian? Okay. How many are atheists? Any Muslims?
Some hands did not go up.
Yeah, somebody undecided.
I don't.
Okay,
After hearing his talk, we're repenting and dusting
If only.
About atheist, I'm going to say atheist, skeptic, agnostic, anywhere in that camp. Let me redo it here. Not okay. And how many are Christian of some variety? Okay. Okay.
Some variety is the key.
The Christians are slightly outnumbering, but it's closer to half and half than I thought it would be. That's good. Good thing. So, anyone else have
Chris, you had a
another
question?
Yeah, Chris.
I've actually started reading Hidden in Plain View. Didn't get through nearly as much as I wanted to before tonight, but I wanted to ask you because you brought it up in the video you did for us talking about Bart Ehrman's book, and you talked. It was a real brief snippet where you talked about contradictions that Ehrman claims, and you mentioned that they're either not really contradictions or the technical term used was small beans.
Yeah.
But they're minor contradictions. They're on the periphery of the story.
Yeah.
They're irrelevant. But from what I've gotten from the book so far, the undesigned coincidences are things like there was green grass at the feeding of the 5,000, or why was there empty
Water pots in John 2, or right.
But the idea that's presented in the introduction and the story is that okay, we're making a cumulative argument to support the Gospels.
Right.
So I guess the question would be if these relatively small undesigned coincidences can be used to build a greater argument in favor of the Gospels, why can't tiny discrepancies build a case against it?
Perfectly reasonable question. So here's the short version of the answer that does not involve math. Okay, and then there's a longer and a more elaborate one that does, and I'm sorry about that, but this is, you brought in somebody who does probability theory for a living, and so that's kind of where my head lives. But the first thing that we have to do is to calibrate our expectations. And to do that, what we want to do is to look at what happens when we have historical testimony from multiple sources, not just derived from one another, for a secular historical event, and see to what extent there are discrepancies there. So let's just take the death of Julius Caesar. We've got multiple accounts of the death of Julius Caesar, and they all agree on many things. Julius Caesar was accosted by the conspirators in the Forum. He was stabbed to death. They even agree on the number of stab wounds. But when you start cross-comparing these things and reading them like Bart likes to read the Gospels, you find that funny things start happening. What was the name of the first conspirator to confront Caesar? It was Tillius Cimber, or maybe it was Tullius Cimber, or a third source says Metilius Cimber, or a fourth one says Cimber Tullius, reversing the first and last name. So what, we all say, and that's exactly the right response. Okay, but we have multiple sources. They're reasonably accurate. They agree on the main things, but they're disagreeing here. Okay, where was the first blow struck? Well, you just have to read the text. It was in his throat. But to parody Bart, who likes to say, well, it depends on which gospel you read. Now, I can say it depends on which Roman historian you read. Maybe it was in his back. Maybe it was in his throat. Well, and some of them don't say where it was struck. What shall we do? Did anybody grab his cloak? Two sources say someone did. Other sources don't say. Is that a contradiction? How should we reconcile it if it is? If somebody did grab his cloak, did they pull it up around his head to blind him, or down around his arms to hold them to his side? One source says one thing, one source says another. It depends on which historian you read. So, calibrate your expectations. No Roman historian says, well, these are just crappy sources, and why could we ever believe the major events that they record? We roll with it. We realize that the ordinary character of human testimony in history is substantial truth with variation of circumstance. Different people notice different things. Events take place across time, and maybe some things happen at one moment in time and other things happen at another moment. But we need, first of all, to say, if it really happened in broadly this way, what kind of reportage should we expect? What kind of variation in the reportage? Yes, even discrepancies should we expect? Once we do that, And we get a baseline, and we can go through other examples if you'd like to talk about the death of Sisera or the death of Caracalla. There are similar things in the sources for these as well. Then we have a baseline. We're like, okay, honest reportage, reasonably close to the facts, tends to vary in approximately this way. So here's a principle of evidence. If you would expect a certain kind of phenomenon, if a certain hypothesis were true, and then you find that phenomenon, that can't be evidence against the hypothesis. And I can parse that out mathematically if you need to, but I think intuitively you're tracking with me. You see what I'm saying here. If you would expect some variation, in fact, some variation that would lead to say, we don't even see how we can sort these things all out, then if you find it, that's not by itself evidence against the hypothesis. Now, if my hypothesis were the Gospels portray with photographic accuracy and absolute precision and unfailing truth every single detail exactly as it went down, then you could look at this stuff and you could say to me, well, they don't, because look at all these differences, and how are you going to deal with that? And you would be right. But what I'm trying to say is, I think these are trustworthy historical documents in the ordinary sense of trustworthy that you would use with Tacitus, that you would use with Josephus for the things that are close to his own lifetime. They're not about the things where he's trying to reach back hundreds or thousands of years and talk about them, but things to which he could have had access, at least to eyewitnesses if he wasn't one himself. There, we say, yeah, Josephus is pretty reliable. Is he perfect? No, he even gives different details about the death of Herod the Great's favorite wife, Miriam. Did he forget? Did he learn something in between the writing of the one and writing the other? Not a big deal, right? You ask a Josephus historian, they'll be like, yeah, not a big deal. So on the front of the discrepancies, that's what I want to say if, but there is an if the discrepancies are not so numerous and so central that we wouldn't expect that many or that large of ones even in the normal variation in historical writing. Because if they exceed those bounds, then we still have some explaining to do. That's still an issue. But my contention for you here is I'm not trying to persuade you that the Bible is inspired. I'm not trying to persuade you that the Gospels are inerrant. It's simply that this is reportage fairly close up to the facts, nearly as close as Boswell was to Johnson. And these are people who are trying to tell it to you the way they remember it. That's all I'm asking for. Now, what happens when we calibrate with regard to the undesigned coincidences? Because as you rightly point out, a lot of them deal with small details. Frankly, I love the fact that they deal with small details, because one of the explanations that takes out of play is that there's some heavy theological reason for reading in Mark chapter 6 that the grass was green, right? They're just little tiny details and nobody makes any heavy weather about them. That's actually, in some ways, better. They're not all clustered around miracles, and they're not all clustered away from miracles. They just sort of get salted randomly through the text, sometimes falling on a miracle story, sometimes not. That's also good because, again, it tends to undermine the claim, well, but these are theologically motivated attempts to retell the story in ways that will frame it up and make their theological points. Actually, they're just kind of scattershot across the texts. But if a lot of little discrepancies don't amount to much, why should a lot of little undesigned coincidences amount to much? Here's the reason, I think, and it goes right back to the same principle I want you to use for the discrepancies, which is calibration. What's the alternative to the idea that these accounts are substantially trustworthy, derived from sources that are pretty close up to the facts and trying to be truthful? Well, the alternative is that one or the other of those claims went wrong, maybe both. Either the sources really aren't very close to the facts, and then they're just like elaborating things that they heard from people who heard from people who heard, or they're deliberately inventing things or deliberately changing things. And the trouble is, from all that we know about fictions and forgeries, and we have a lot of them, we have a lot of second century forged quote-unquote Gospels, They don't interlock. So take the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of the Hebrews. All of these Gnostic Gospels exist and are great examples of people making stuff up, and try to find undesigned coincidences among them. I've tried, because I'm not such a fool as to think nobody else will think of that idea. I can't find them. And I would encourage you to do this for yourself, okay? There are nice copies of all the Gnostic Gospels out there. You can find them at the early Christian writings site online that Peter Kirby put together back when he was still an atheist, before he kind of halfway jumped ship. You can find copies of them. If you can't find copies of them, I'll send you copies of them. But don't trust me, because maybe I handpicked the translations. Go do some research, look around and try. And when you calibrate like that, you'll discover that if that hypothesis were right, that these people weren't close up to the facts and tried to be truthful, we wouldn't find those. And here we do. But it is the kind of thing that you would expect if they were close up to the facts and tried to be truthful, because we have 4 largely overlapping reports about the same set of events. Yeah, they have some unique material in each one. Fine, great. But still, curiously, even John, who's kind of the odd one out in terms of how much unique material he possesses, does interlock in multiple directions. And it's not all Mark explains everybody else, because Mark was first. No, Mark explains John, and John explains Mark, and John explains Matthew, and Matthew explains Luke, and back and forth it goes, all over, every which way. They crisscross the Gospels with no discernible directedness to it. That's weird if you're coming up with a theory, well, there was just one creative genius who finally said, I'm going to make all of this fit together in a really funky way. They don't.
So, Tim, what would you say, in Mark you have the Messianic secret, which I know you're familiar with, where Jesus heals someone and he says, oh, don't tell anybody.
Yeah.
And he never mentions, the statements like, I am the light of the world. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. John has this high Christology. Mark has a low Christology. And it just seems, in Mark, he doesn't say anything about himself. In John, that's all he does is talk about himself. How can you reconcile
Okay, so let me make 2 points about that. Okay, first of all, I'm going to contest the claim that Mark has a low Christology.
Okay.
And I would refer you here, I'll give you an example myself, but then I would also refer you to Simon Gathercole's work. He's a New Testament scholar at Cambridge. His contention is, in his words, the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. And you can say, wow, how'd Cambridge let him slip in? That was just terrible. But there it is. Now, just because he's an authority doesn't mean he's right. Here I am contradicting things Bart is saying, and Bart is definitely a well-qualified authority, so you're absolutely fine if you want to read what he said and then make up your own mind and say, I just think he's wrong, that's fine. I think one of the things that moves many scholars is the example in Mark chapter 2 of the healing of the man who's paralyzed and is brought by his friends, and they try to dig up the roof and drop him through it, and Jesus just casually turns to him and he says, your sins are forgiven. And wow, the people who are lurking around the corners hoping to catch Jesus out start murmuring, because who can forgive sins but God alone? I think they get it, and I think Jesus pulls their chain a little bit on exactly that point, because his response then is, which is easier? To say, your sins are forgiven, or to say, take up your bed and walk? Well, which is easier? Funny thing that, it's a typically Jewish question, because you can actually answer either way depending on how you take it. On the one hand, it's less of a claim to power to say, take up your bed and walk, than it is to say, I forgive your sins. Who the hell do you think you are, forgiving sins? That's crazy, right? On the other hand, which is easier to get away with? Oh, your sins are forgiven, and who would know, right? But take up your bed and walk, now you're putting it on the line, okay? And then Jesus says, but so that you may know that the Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, stand up, pick up your bed, walk. And he does. Now, I'm not done. I have more to say. I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, yeah, that's what Mark says. But guess what? Big surprise. We don't believe the Gospels. But I'm just trying to give you the picture of what Mark is trying to do. Bracket the question of whether Mark is giving you a record of anybody. Bracket, for all I care, though I pray for you, the question of whether there was a historical Jesus. Okay? Just set that aside for the minute. Mark is doing something in this text. He's trying to say something. What's he trying to say? I think that he's giving you Jesus' own claims to the prerogatives of deity. Now, why don't we find before Abraham was, I am in Mark? Well, where's most of Mark set? The teaching of Jesus. What's the setting for most of that? It's Galilee. It's the north part. And only down at the end does Mark start narrating a trip to Jerusalem, and then everything goes to hell in a handbasket and Jesus gets crucified, okay? But most of that's up in Galilee. John has most of the teaching of Jesus down south in the region of Jerusalem and Judea. So they're different contexts. Even when John's got a few things that are up in Galilee, you'll find, if you're reading in John 6, for example, at the end of it, he went out of the synagogue. So he's not out in the open preaching to thousands of people in crowds. He's preaching to a narrower group. So what? Why should that matter? Well, in John chapter 6, after the feeding of the 5,000, what does John say ends that day? How does it wrap up? Jesus looks at the crowds and he sees that they have a mind to take him and make him king by force. And that's not the kind of Messiah that he intends to be. And so he leaves. In Galilee, where the blood ran hot, the zealots had a little bit more of a foothold, and people were looking for their next leader. And it would have been, let's just say, foolhardy for someone who didn't intend to be that kind of a leader to make broad, direct statements of being I am out of Exodus, right? In that context, down in Judea, down in Jerusalem in particular, where the Jewish leadership is centered, is the place where it's most appropriate for him to make the most explicit claims about himself. So when you look at the venue in which these things were said, you'll find that very largely, not 100%, okay, I don't want to overstate it, but very largely, these are in separate contexts that Jesus is saying these two different groups of people. In the one place, he's intimating his identity by saying, your sins are forgiven. In another place, he's being much more explicit. And what do down there? They pick up stones to stone him. And he says, well, for which of my good deeds are you trying to stone me? Not for any of your good deeds, but because you, being a man, make yourself equal with God. Okay, they get it. Now, my good Unitarian and Jehovah's Witness friends don't think that was really what Jesus meant, and they think Jesus should have said, wait, no, you've misunderstood me. I'm sorry. I don't get the impression of Jesus as a guy who fumbled his words and then had to try to figure out how to get out of the hot seat. This is a guy who knew what he was saying, and if he wanted to put a finger in your eye, he was going to put a finger in your eye. And he's doing it. I don't think he misspoke. I don't think he was misunderstood. I don't think he intended to be. You may not buy that, Bill, but I'm trying to at least give what you can see as an honest attempt to give a rational answer.
I just thought John wasn't concerned about chronology. You might not realize this, but in the Synoptics, the cleansing of the temple is at the end of Jesus' ministry. In John, it's at the beginning. And Christian apologists will say, oh, well, there was two different cleansings. That's like blowing out the White House twice. I mean, it's nuts. What do you say to that?
I disagree. We've got examples where Muslim radicals have harassed people at the same restaurant, walking up and down in front of the restaurant, yelling Allahu Akbar, and then going away, after 5 minutes, and then they'll come back a couple days later. And we've got video surveillance cameras and police forces on deck to come out and do this. No, I actually don't find it that way. And let me show you a detail for why I actually think it happened twice. So let's go to John chapter 2. Okay? So here's a fun little bit that you find right at the end of John chapter 2. Okay? Small print and bad eyes. Sorry, guys. So the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? He's just cleansed the temple. This is John chapter 2, verse 18. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, and this is the one I want you to pay attention to. This is preaching flyover territory. It's not a sexy verse. Nobody wants to preach a sermon on it. But it matters, okay? The Jews said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? One down. When did the temple begin to be built?
I don't know.
20 BC.
18 or 19. What's 46 years from that? 26, 27 AD. What are the two most common estimates for the year that Jesus was crucified? 30 and 33. So if this is 26 to 27 BC, then it's the beginning of his public ministry if he was crucified in 30, not the end of his public ministry. But it gets better. What happens just before Jesus enters upon public ministry? Who's the big deal? Who's the big cheese? But all of Jerusalem is going out to see. John the Baptist. So, not in John now, but back in Luke, more flyover territory, Luke chapter 3. In the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea, Herod being tetrarch of Galilee, the word of God came to John the son of Zechariah in the wilderness. When's the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar? Well, when did Tiberius Caesar begin to be Caesar? There's an ambiguity on that question. Augustus died in the year 14. But 2 years before he died, in order to ensure that there would be a smooth transition of power, he made his adopted son Tiberius co-emperor in the year 12. And this is celebrated numismatically. We've got this stamped on coins that say that, okay? Now, the way that the Romans, like the Jews, counted years was that any part of a year counts as a year. So if you take in the 15th year, that means 14 years plus something, okay? And you start with 12 and you go 14 years forward, you're at 26 plus something for John just before Jesus, who does his first public act there 46 years after the beginning of the building of the temple. And so it's because of those chronological specifics, not because, gee whiz, oh no, maybe he just screwed up, but because of those specifics that I actually think he did this twice. And I think that's why later in John, Jesus doesn't just go down to Jerusalem when he's expected. Or literally, I should say, up, because it's southward, but it is uphill. He goes down in secret and then suddenly shows up. And when he does, they want to arrest him, but they're afraid of the crowds, which we learn about in Matthew and in Luke. You know, when Jesus is saying these things, the crowds are on his side. In John, it says they sent out some soldiers to grab him, and the soldiers came back, and they're like, no way. Mm-hmm. So I don't think it's merely a bit of apologetic flummery to say this happened twice. There are specific chronological reasons for thinking that it did. Now, you may not be persuaded by this. That's okay. We're doing this fast. I want to give you, again, something that doesn't sound like an evasion. I want to point to specific things and make inferences from them and let you see that whatever else is the case, even if you're not persuaded, I'm not trying to hoodwink you.
No, it's just when I went and heard John Shelby Spong was here at TCU, his opening statement was, nothing in the Gospel of John is historical, and as you know, and none of the words come out of Jesus. And you know the Jesus seminar, everything's in black. None of those words originated with Jesus.
So let me do this before you answer that one.
Yeah.
We're also broadcasting. We have a live audience as well.
Hi, live audience, wherever you are.
And so we do have some questions coming in, and I also want to get back to that question, but also I think Jim has a question he wants to ask.
I'll get it.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Dude, there's 19 other people.
I'm going to ask Renee Grigsby if she will share from our live streaming audience has a question, I think.
Okay, Doug from California said, question for Tim. Does a Christian need to affirm that there are no contradictions in the Gospels? Can't someone become a Christian and have a vibrant faith even if they think there are some discrepancies in the text?
Yes, my wife is an example. Okay? So, now, that doesn't mean that it's not an interesting question to discuss. But yes, clearly C.S. Lewis thought that there were errors in the Gospels. Not very big ones and not very many, but he was certainly not what we would today call an inerrantist. So yeah, I mean, if C.S. Lewis wasn't a Christian, we are in trouble. So I'm not trying to minimize the importance of the question, but yes, clearly the answer to the question is someone can be a Christian and have a vibrant faith without thinking that the Gospels are without discrepancy. Sure.
Do we have another one too?
Yes. We have a guy, John from Arlington, Virginia, and he says, are there any scholars who don't work at confessional institutions who believe the cleansing of the temple occurred twice? This seems like the kind of view that exists exclusively, or almost so, among people who have a theological need to harmonize the gospel.
Okay, so first point, I think I've just answered the bit about a theological need.
He asked a minute ago. It's been
Right, but you all are my witnesses here. Did I appeal to the burning in my bosom or to some theological need as I answered that? No, I did not. Okay, but the second thing is, I don't know. I have not taken a poll. I would suggest.
Let me ask you this: do you work at a confessional?
Yeah, no, I do not. It's amazing that Western Michigan University doesn't make me sign a statement of faith every year. At least not a religious one, kind of.
So Jim had a question.
I got 67 questions.
Oh.
I got it boiled down to the best couple. So
Can you hit me with them one at a time, just out of pity? All right.
Great to meet you, Tim, by the
Thanks.
way. I'm Jim Hall.
Awesome. Yeah, we
And,
could maybe do a little thing for your podcast
Yes,
later.
that would be awesome.
Sure.
That would be an honor. And thanks for the food. Thanks for having us, James. Okay. Chris, that was my best one. You stole it. The death by 10,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
What I was gonna just bring up is, does if they're all minuscule, the aggregate of them together, is that present a problem? So as a corollary, how do you pronounce that?
Corollary.
Corollary. All right. Is there one in particular, or maybe are there a couple in particular that make you scratch your head? Or first off, you said your wife.
Mm-hmm.
She does find some contradictions.
Yeah.
Do you?
So, no, but that doesn't mean that I don't think there could be.
Are there any that make you just kind of scratch your head a little?
Yes. There. Does that help? Yeah.
The one that jumped out at me real quick.
Yeah.
First off, I'm a historicist. I think Jesus, if I gun to my head, he probably did exist. And I don't know
I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
We're making progress.
Out of the atheists here, I bet you'd be hard pressed. Are you a mythicist? I think most of us are historicists.
All good.
So
all good. We're on the same page so far.
We don't really have a horse in this race at all.
Fine.
It's very interesting. Where was I going with that?
I don't know. You were saying your best one.
Well, not the best one. The first one that jumped out in my head was the last word problem. You know,
the last words of Jesus
now,
on the cross.
The most important person that ever lived on the earth, his last words. You'd think at least that would get recorded.
Okay. So
why has thou forsaken me?
So
unto thy spirit, hands I commend my spirit. It is finished.
Totally contradictory. One's like,
So,
oh my God, this thing is
right.
now. Why have you forsaken me? The other's, I commend my
okay.
spirit.
So can I make 2 points
sir.
in response to that? The first point is, remember what I said earlier about our view of how important Jesus was and everybody else's view. So we have to be careful about saying, wow, you would surely record his last words. Engage your historical imagination. Jesus is being crucified here for, 6 hours. Even if those words came somewhere deep into that, obviously there's a lot of time for him to say a lot of things, and not everybody records everything. Now, if you had 4 guys with camcorders standing there, fresh batteries, we're good, we got this, and then their camcorders were showing you very different things happening, okay, now we got a problem. But realistically speaking, you can say all of the 7 Dominical sayings from the cross. You can read these off, at twice over in a minute.
There's 3 that specifically end. The ones I just
yeah.
mentioned,
So
specifically end with, and he then gave up the ghost.
Right. Yeah. So what if he said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Or into your hands I commend my spirit. He said, it's finished. And he died. And one guy was right up close, and he heard the it's finished, and somebody else didn't. Do real people sometimes not all hear all of the... Heck, some of you back there probably are having trouble hearing some of the things I'm saying. Sorry, I'll speak up. But, yeah, I mean, in real physical situations that occur across many hours, even what somebody writes down as the last thing he writes down of the 2 or 3 things he writes down that Jesus said in that whole time, and then writes down that he breathed his last, may not be the very last thing Jesus said because somebody else was a little closer. Well, who would have been closer? What do we know from John? In John, Jesus actually says from the cross, he points to the disciple he loves, and he says, yeah, woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother. And John, in a fascinating passage, says, and from that hour he took her to his own home. The classicist E.M. Blakelock says actually what that seems to be saying is, and at that very hour he took her to his own home. But that's not the end of John's description of the crucifixion. It's close, but it looks like John came back having got Mary away. Gosh, who wants to leave a mother watching that? Come on, just try to be human and realistic for a moment. Who wants to?
Time frame? I don't know.
Yeah, but if he took her and came back, and we know that John and the Synoptics both say this is taking place across hours. If he took her away and came back, he could have missed stuff in between as well.
Makes perfect sense to me.
So
that's a good answer.
You know, that's what I got for you. Is it a proof? No, it's not a proof. I'm not trying to claim that.
Why I just thought of the Monty Python movie, "Blessed Are the Cheesemakers."
Yeah,
because it kind of goes in line with what you were saying. What did he say back there?
No, it's any dairy product. Right.
Yeah, good one.
Well, let's do this. We've been here about an hour, so a little bit more. So what we're going to do is take a break for about, let's say, 15 minutes, and we have a lot more questions to do. I'm also going to be talking about in the next book club, what we're going to be doing in the next book club. Go like a 3-minute video to show you on that. So we're going to take a break right now. I'll have some coffee in there in a minute. There's some soft drinks, and for our live stream audience, if you'll just keep watching, we're going to cut the feed and we're going to come right back. It'll be at the same location, and we'll pick up in about 15 minutes. Thanks.